What happens when a police officer sworn to protect and serve becomes the very thing she was trained to fight against? In the case of Antoinette Renee Frank, the line between right and wrong blurred to a point of no return. A woman who wore the badge with pride turned the power she held into a deadly weapon, committing a crime that would leave the city of New Orleans in shock. This is the story of a woman on death row whose shocking betrayal of her badge and the murders that followed would haunt her forever. Antoinette Frank's story begins in New Orleans, Louisiana, on April 30th, 1971. Raised in a household marked by turmoil and abuse, Antoinette's path to law enforcement seemed unlikely. Her father, Adam Frank, was a Vietnam War veteran who subjected her to years of physical and sexual abuse, an experience that would haunt Antoinette's life. Yet, despite this dark upbringing, Antoinette sought to escape her troubled past and made a decision that would lead her to the New Orleans Police Department. In early 1993, Antoinette applied to the NOPD. Despite failing 2 psychiatric evaluations and being caught lying on her application, she was hired. The department was desperate for officers, and Antoinette's background, though far from ideal, was overlooked. What followed was a career that quickly became marked by questionable behavior. Although she graduated near the top of her class at the police academy, her time on the force was riddled with difficulties. Fellow officers found her shy, indecisive, and at times irrational. Yet Antoinette did have moments of recognition, winning Officer of the Month from the local Kiwanis Club for community work. But behind this veneer of professionalism, she was forging a dangerous relationship with someone who would change her life forever. In the fall of 1994, Antoinette Frank's life took a dangerous turn when she encountered Rogers Lacaze, a man with a criminal past and a reputation that should have warned her away. Lacaze, a drug dealer with a violent streak, had been shot, and Frank was one of the officers who responded to the scene. What seemed like a routine call quickly morphed into something far more personal when Frank, instead of sticking to her professional role, found herself drawn to Lacaze. At first, Frank's intentions appeared innocent enough. She claimed that she simply wanted to help him, to turn his life around. But as they spent more time together, it became clear that Frank wasn't just trying to save him, she was falling for him. Lacaze's rebellious attitude, his disregard for authority, and his dangerous lifestyle seemed to captivate Frank in a way she hadn't expected. The allure of his bad boy persona took hold, and what began as an officer trying to assist a troubled individual quickly transformed into a romantic entanglement that would have devastating consequences. Despite her position as a police officer, Frank's relationship with Lacaze was becoming public. Other officers started noticing strange behavior. Lacaze was seen driving Frank's squad car and even accompanying her on official calls. On one occasion, he was introduced as a trainee to others, a lie that quickly unraveled as his presence at crime scenes grew more frequent. Frank's colleagues began whispering about the unusual closeness between the two, but Frank refused to see the danger. She justified it to herself, believing she was helping Lacaze in ways the law couldn't. Her relationship with Lacaze quickly spiraled out of control. Frank, once a diligent officer, started making reckless choices that undermined her career and her sense of duty. She ignored the rules she was supposed to uphold, engaging in petty crimes with Lacaze, including robbing people while in her police car. But the danger wasn't just in her relationship with Lacaze, it was in the fact that Frank was now stepping into a world where right and wrong no longer mattered. By March 1995, Antoinette Frank's life had collided with tragedy and violence in the most shocking way imaginable. She and Rogers Lacaze, who had by now fully embraced their criminal partnership, devised a plan that would end in bloodshed at the Kim Ang restaurant, a local Vietnamese establishment where Frank worked off duty as a security guard.
The night of March 4, 1995, started like any other at the restaurant. The Vu family, who ran Kim Eng, were finishing up their work as usual, preparing to close for the night. At the same time, Frank and Lacaze made their way to the restaurant, disguised as innocent patrons. The two had visited earlier that evening to get leftover food, and on the third visit, Frank had stolen a key to the restaurant, an action that would soon prove crucial in the deadly plan they were about to execute. Inside the restaurant, Chow Vu, one of the family members, noticed Frank returning and sensed something was wrong. But before she could react, Frank burst through the door. This time, however, it wasn't to buy food, it was to rob and kill. Frank pushed Chow, her brother Kwok, and a restaurant employee into the kitchen where they were ordered to stay. Frank, with a sense of cold authority, was now the one in control. Officer Ronald Williams II, a fellow NOPE officer and a colleague of Frank's, was working security at the time. He had been in the restaurant to ensure everything went smoothly, but as he followed Frank into the kitchen, Lacaze shot him from behind. The bullet severed Williams' spinal cord, instantly paralyzing him. But Lacaze didn't stop there. He continued to shoot Williams, this time in the head and back, ensuring he would never get back up. As Frank moved through the restaurant, chaos erupted. She was searching for the money the Vu family had hidden in the kitchen, demanding to know where it was. When Chow and Kwok attempted to hide, Frank found them and began shouting at Ha and Kwong Vu, the younger siblings. Ha, a 21-year-old young woman, tried to plead for her life as she knelt before Frank. It didn't matter. Frank shot her 3 times. Kwong, 17, was also gunned down, shot 6 times. With the money in her hands, Frank turned to leave, but not before making sure that the 2 survivors would be left in fear for their lives. But it wasn't over. Frank and Lacaze fled the scene, and as they drove away, the unimaginable happened. Frank heard the police radio crackling with a call about an officer down at Kim Eng restaurant. Her response? A chilling one. Frank, knowing the police were on their way, returned to the scene, this time in a police patrol car, to finish what she had started. She intended to silence the witnesses, Chow and Kwok, once and for all.
As the sirens wailed in the distance, signaling the arrival of law enforcement, Antoinette Frank was already on her way back to the Kim On restaurant. The shock of the brutal murders hadn't yet reached the city streets, but Frank, knowing exactly what she had done, had only one objective: to eliminate the witnesses who could bring her down. Having fled the scene with Rogers Lacaze, Frank realized the weight of her actions. She had killed her fellow officer, Ronald Williams, and 2 innocent members of the Vu family. The final piece of the puzzle was still in place: Cho and Kwok, the 2 survivors who had hidden in the walk-in freezer. They had witnessed everything, and as the police would soon arrive, their accounts could seal Frank's fate. The desperation was palpable as Frank decided to return to the crime scene. Armed with a police patrol car and uniform, she thought she could blend in and escape suspicion. Frank pulled the car up behind the restaurant, parking it in the rear. As she stepped out, she didn't show the slightest hesitation. This was no longer about a robbery gone wrong. This was about making sure there would be no survivors to testify. Inside the restaurant, Cho was in the front, still waiting for help to arrive. Frank's return wasn't unnoticed, though. Cho, who had been hiding from Frank earlier, immediately recognized the officer who had caused so much death and pain. Frank approached Cho, casually identifying herself as a fellow officer, trying to conceal the dark truth of her involvement. It was at that moment that Cho, driven by fear and desperation, cried out, "You killed my brother and sister!" The words hung in the air, cutting through the tense silence. Cho's recognition and brave declaration shattered any illusion of innocence Frank had left. She was caught.
Frank tried to pass herself off as just another responding officer, but Cho wasn't fooled. The truth was already out in the open. She was the one who had come to murder, to cover up her tracks, and to silence the only witnesses who could bring her to justice. As Cho fled into the arms of the arriving officers, Frank's cold demeanor remained intact. She tried to feign confusion, hoping to convince the responding officers that she had no knowledge of what had happened. But Cho's screams echoed in her ears as the officers pieced together the horrifying scene that had unfolded in the restaurant just moments before. It didn't take long for the investigation to connect the dots. Frank had been at the scene, and her strange return in a police car was too much of a coincidence. The survivors, though terrified, were now determined to speak out. Frank's attempt to destroy evidence and kill the witnesses only cemented her guilt.
In the wake of the murders, Detective Eddie Rance, who would become deeply involved in the case, described Frank as one of the coldest individuals he had ever encountered in his 30 years of law enforcement. Frank's behavior after the murders was chilling. She wasn't in distress. She wasn't trying to hide her guilt. She was calculating, determined to make sure there were no loose ends. But Chow's bravery in identifying Frank in front of the officers was the first crack in Frank's perfect facade. By the time Frank was brought in for questioning, her fate was all but sealed. Frank, ever defiant, initially denied her involvement. But the mounting evidence, witness statements, the gunshot wounds on the victims, and the police radio call that placed Frank at the scene was undeniable. Her story began to crumble under the pressure. During the investigation, Frank refused to discuss her actions, but the detectives had already pieced together the truth. A breakthrough came when Frank's own accomplice, Rogers Lacaze, was arrested. Lacaze, who had been with Frank during the robbery and murders, was soon linked to the crime through forensic evidence, including the use of Officer Williams' credit card just moments after the killings. Frank's refusal to give any concrete details about the murders only reinforced the belief that she was hiding something. Finally, when Frank was confronted with the overwhelming evidence, including the testimonies from the Vu family and Lacaze's involvement, her defense began to collapse. After hours of interrogation, Frank's own admission to the murders came as a chilling confirmation of the detective's suspicions. She had been the mastermind behind the robbery, the violence, and the execution-style killings. In a stunning revelation, Frank admitted her role in the murders, but her demeanor remained as cold as ever. The woman who had taken an oath to serve and protect was now the one standing trial for taking innocent lives. Frank's trial began in September 1995, just a few months after her arrest. She was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, the victims being her fellow officer, Ronald Williams II, and 2 members of the Vu family, Ha and Kuang. The courtroom was packed with onlookers, eager to understand the mind behind such brutal violence. Despite the overwhelming evidence stacked against her, Chow and Quoc Vu's testimony, Lacaze's involvement, and the forensic evidence linking Frank to the crime scene, Frank remained defiant. Her attorneys, recognizing the strength of the case against her, decided to not call any witnesses in her defense. In fact, they barely put up a fight against the prosecution's case, and the jury was left with little to deliberate. The prosecution's argument was simple yet powerful. Antoinette Frank was not just a killer, she was a cold, calculating individual who had betrayed the trust of her community, her fellow officers, and the people she swore to protect. They painted a picture of a woman who had spiraled into a world of violence and corruption, driven by a dangerous relationship with a drug dealer, Rogers Lacaze. She had not only taken innocent lives, but had returned to the scene of the crime to finish what she had started, attempting to silence the only witnesses who could bring her to justice. The trial was quick, and the verdict was just as swift. After only 22 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Frank guilty of all charges. It was a record for a capital murder case in New Orleans, a city that had witnessed its share of violent crime. But what was even more chilling was the fact that Frank, a police officer, had been the one to carry out these brutal killings.
the city was still grappling with the reality that a trusted law enforcement officer could turn into a cold-blooded murderer. The following day, the jury recommended the death penalty, and Frank was formally sentenced to death on October 20th, 1995. It was a stunning fall from grace for a woman who had once worn the uniform with pride. Now she would spend the rest of her life on death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel, Louisiana. But even as she was led away in handcuffs, her story was far from over. Her appeal process would be long and complicated, filled with legal maneuvers and arguments about her childhood trauma, her mental health, and her rights as a convicted felon. The death penalty was decided, but the public, the survivors, and even Frank herself were left to wrestle with one chilling question. What had driven her to commit such a violent, senseless act?
After the storm, the Vu family sold the original location of Kim On Restaurant and reopened it in a safer area of Harahan. They moved their residence to Metairie, where they felt they could start over in peace, far from the traumatic memories that would forever linger in their old restaurant. In 1995, a month after her conviction, a disturbing discovery was made under her house, a human skull with a bullet hole. It was later believed to be the remains of her father, Adam Frank, who had gone missing in 1993. Though he lived with her shortly before his disappearance, the police made no serious efforts to link his death to Frank, who was already facing the death penalty for her role in the Kim On murders. The connection between father and daughter's violent ends remains a chilling mystery, and Frank's involvement is still debated. In 2006, Frank's attorneys filed an appeal with the Louisiana Supreme Court, arguing that her death sentence should be reconsidered because she had not been provided with adequate resources during the sentencing phase of her trial. Specifically, they contended that Frank had been denied access to state-funded experts who could have investigated her background for possible mitigating evidence. They brought forward psychiatrists who suggested that Frank may have been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a result of her childhood abuse. However, the court did not find this argument compelling enough to overturn her conviction. In 2007, the Louisiana Supreme Court ruled 5-2 in favor of maintaining Frank's death sentence, dismissing claims that her past trauma should result in a reduction of her punishment. The legal battle continued, but the state stood firm in its decision. Despite these setbacks, Frank's legal team pressed on, finding other avenues to appeal her death sentence. In 2008, her attorneys again petitioned the courts to halt her execution, citing what they believed were violations of her rights during her trial and sentencing. At one point in 2008, a death warrant for Frank was signed, setting her execution date for December 8, 2008. However, a last-minute appeal delayed the execution, and the state's highest courts ruled that Frank should have more time to explore the merits of her case. As the years passed, calls for clemency grew louder. In 2023, Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards, nearing the end of his term, publicly announced his opposition to the death penalty and even advocated for its abolition in the state. This marked a pivotal moment in Frank's case. Frank and 56 other death row inmates filed a clemency petition, arguing that the governor's stance against capital punishment should apply to them as well. However, in June 2023, the Louisiana Board of Pardons rejected all 56 clemency petitions, including Frank's, ruling that such requests could not be filed until a year after a judge had ruled on their latest appeals. Though her clemency petition was denied, Frank's legal team continued to file appeals. The most significant of these came in 2025, when Frank's case was granted a new hearing after a judge accepted her appeal to overturn her death sentence. For the first time in decades, Frank would face the possibility of her sentence being re-evaluated. The renewed appeals process, scheduled for December 2025, left many wondering what the future would hold for Frank. Would she be granted a new trial, or would the state move forward with her execution? Antoinette Frank's case has not only been a legal battle, but has also served as a window into the complexities of the justice system. Her story, one of abuse, corruption, and murder, continues to provoke debate. Was she a victim of her circumstances, or was she simply a cold-blooded killer? As Frank's legal team prepares for the upcoming hearing in 2025, the unanswered questions about her mental state, her actions, and her fate remain central to the case. Her story has evolved from a shocking crime committed by a police officer to a broader discussion about the death penalty, justice, and the human cost of trauma. For the survivors of the Kim Ang restaurant murders, the Vu family, the pain of losing loved ones remains, but so does the hope that justice will eventually prevail. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime content. Join the conversation in the comments below. What do you think about Antoinette Frank's case? Was justice served, or are there deeper questions that still need to be answered? Stay tuned as we continue to explore more chilling cases that keep you questioning the truth. Until next time, stay vigilant and keep searching for the facts.